this video I want to talk about biological media in our aquarium filters, and this is going to be a very contentious topic, so I expect a lot of hateful comments. We live in the times when we are constantly exposed to information by canister filter manufacturers, by manufacturers of biological filtration media such as Biohome, for example, that we need to achieve this full cycle of filtration, that we need to achieve this conversion of ammonia into nitrites and nitrites into nitrates and reduction of nitrates to a very low level. And in order to achieve this full cycle of filtration, this nitrogen cycle, we need to buy very expensive biological medias. And as a beginner fish keeper, you will probably be exposed to this information constantly, and you will probably take it for face value, as I have for many years. And for many years I actually believed that investing into high quality biological media such as, for example, Sikkim Matrix, I've got it here, or Fluval Biomax rings, which is also an expensive media, or this is Eheim Substrate Pro. I don't have a sample of Biohome, but you know what I'm talking about. I believed for many years that actually investing in this high quality media is what keeps my fish tanks clean, my fish healthy, my nitrate levels so low. I've believed in that for quite a lot of years, and I've invested quite a lot of money into this expensive biological media. And I'm sure that a lot of Biohome users right now will tell me that this is absolutely true, and that without Biohome or without any of this expensive biological media, they would never achieve stable tanks, they will never have nitrates as low as they have, and that this high quality and highly expensive biological media are an important and maybe inseparable part of our hobby. But over the years, as the number of my tanks started to grow, I realized that in those tanks where I only have like sponge filter like this one, or where I have relatively cheap biological media such as lava rock, this is lava rock for example, or alpha grok, and this is alpha grok. I'm sure you know alpha grok. This is artificially made biological media, mostly used in ponds, but also excessively used in fish tanks as well. So these are two examples of a very cheap biological media that cannot be compared in terms of price with more expensive biological media types. I notice it in my tanks where I only have this type of media or just sponge filters. I actually have very similar water parameters as in the tanks with more expensive biological media. I also have zero ammonia, zero nitrites, and very low levels of nitrates, like 10 ppm or up to 20 ppm. So I was wondering what's the case. I have invested quite a lot of cash into this expensive biological media, and why do I have the same water parameters in tanks with expensive media and in tanks with cheap or basically just a sponge filter? So in this video I will push forward a very contentious argument that you don't really need to invest in this expensive biological media in order to achieve top water quality, in order to have zero ammonia, zero nitrites, and very low levels of nitrates. I will talk about the cases when you actually need to invest in some biological media in order to have it in your tank. But in most cases, and many of your tanks will probably don't really need any high quality or maybe any biological media at all. I know quite a lot of you will disagree with me, but bear with me. So why do we need this biological media in the first place? We need it in order to host beneficial bacteria, so-called aerobic bacteria, which lives on the surface of things, like on the surface of biological media, and that needs oxygen to survive, or to host so-called anaerobic bacteria, which lives in places where there's no oxygen, such as, for example, in substrate or in those parts of biological media. If you have a porous biological media, for example, lava rock is not a porous biological media, but For example, fluval biomass rings, they are supposed to be porous biological media, so it has channels inside. That's where anaerobic bacteria can create colonies, and these are the type of bacteria that don't need oxygen to survive. And in order to achieve this full cycle of filtration, we need to have both aerobic and anaerobic bacteria in our filtration. So anaerobic bacteria actually help in reducing nitrates. But let's think about where else this beneficial bacteria can live in our tanks. Most of us have tanks with substrate, with all sorts of decorations, with plants, either aquatic plants or riparian plants. In my case, I have in this tank both aquatic plants underwater and riparian plants. But if you only have aquatic plants, and that's what most of fish keepers usually have, that's also great, because all of these things, substrate, decoration, aquatic plants, riparian plants, they provide surface for bacteria, primarily for aerobic bacteria to populate. So the bacteria will live on all of these things. They don't live in the water column. They need something to get attached to in order to colonize the surface. But especially substrate, if you have the more substrate you have, the more surface you have for this aerobic bacteria. And actually, if you have a fine substrate like sand, for example, and you have a thick layer of that substrate, thick layer of sand, you're likely to host a lot of aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, because if you have deep layer of sand, anaerobic bacteria will live in inner layers of that sand substrate, in places where there is no oxygen, so that's where they will live. If you pick up any of the older, like 20 or 30 years old aquatic books, aquarium books, you will always see authors talking about the importance of substrate as the layer of filtration. So basically your substrate will serve as the most important layer of filtration. That's where the bacteria will multiply, and that's where they will live. And that's absolutely true. The more substrate you have, the more bacteria you have. Of course, you have to vacuum clean, or you have to siphon your substrate from time to time, but nevertheless it provides this important area for beneficial bacteria. Think about everything else you have in your tank. Driftwood, rocks, plants, they all provide lots of area for your beneficial bacteria to survive. And then you think about bioload. Possibly you don't have that much fish in order to produce so much ammonia that you need some extra territory for this beneficial bacteria. So maybe you don't even need an external filter with all the biological media. You may need a filter that will collect all the debris, that will collect all sort of dirt, which will provide mechanical filtration. But maybe you already have enough surface area in your tank for beneficial bacteria to colonize, so you don't really need some extra surface. Because if your fish do not produce enough waste, if they don't produce enough bioload, you're not going to have enough ammonia for all this bacteria to live on, to feed on. And if you don't have enough ammonia for this beneficial bacteria to feed on, you may be running your internal canister filter in vain. Your canister filter might have all this expensive, porous, large surface biological media, but you may not have enough ammonia for this bacteria to survive. So this biological filter media will just rest in your canister doing nothing, basically, because all the surface area that you have in your tank will already host enough bacteria to break down ammonia into nitrites and nitrites into nitrates. So before thinking about investing quite a lot of your money into expensive biological media, think about what you have in your tank, how much fish you have, what's the bioload that they produce, and whether you have a layer of substrate, decorations, lots of driftwood, rock work, and live plants, because they will already provide lots of surface area for beneficial bacteria to colonize. The other thing to consider is whether you have live plant, aquatic or riparian plants in your setup. If you do, just think about what these plants are doing. They're not just there for decoration, they are actually feeding on ammonia, nitrates, and nitrates as well. And they need quite a lot of them, especially if you have fast growing plants, stem plants, maybe some larger plants with massive root systems such as echinodorus plants. They need quite a lot of nutrition, and their primary source of nutrition is ammonia. Yeah, there are some plants such as, for example, echinodorus, Amazon sort plants, that can also feed on nitrates, but most of the plants, they feed on ammonia. So let's put it this way: beneficial bacteria on your biological media in your filter, they feed on ammonia. They need ammonia to survive, and your plants need the same source of nutrients. They also need ammonia. So it's quite logical to assume that both your plants and bacteria on your biological media, they are competing for the same source of food, and either of them will outcompete the other. So it means that if you have a mature established biological filter with lots of biological media that has a lot of surface for beneficial bacteria, your plants will be deprived of any nutrition. There will be no ammonia in your tank. So you will have to fertilize your plants. So basically you will have to supply them with extra nutrition in order to survive, because if there is no nutrients in the water column, most of the plants that actually feed on nutrients from water column, they will starve. The other end of that equation is that if you already have lots of growing aquatic or riparian plants in your system and you add extra biological filtration, it is likely that your plants will already consume all the ammonia that they need, and your beneficial bacteria, which you expect to colonize your biological media, will have no food to survive. So there will be not enough ammonia for beneficial bacteria on your biological media in order to exist there. So again, you're going to have a canister with expensive biological media in it, and it will do nothing. Obviously we can't say whether it does something or not, because we don't know whether there are any beneficial bacteria in your canister. But if you have a planted tank with lots of fast growing, active, healthy plants, it is likely that if you also have a canister with biological media, that canister does absolutely nothing, because those beneficial bacteria on your biological media, they will literally get no food from your tank. They will be there, but they might host some amount of beneficial, mostly aerobic bacteria, but very little. And there is absolutely no point of having a canister in a planted tank, because plants are already performing all the filtration. They will already be doing the nitrogen cycle, and it's absolutely excessive and unnecessary to have biological filtration on a planted tank, even if you have riparian plants like I have, and actually especially if you have riparian plants, because they're really nutrient hungry and they will consume all the ammonia your fish will ever be able to produce. So having a canister with biological media, or any filter with biological media on a tank like this, is a waste of your money, it's waste of biological media, and it's waste of your time, to be honest. So about a year ago I started replacing all this expensive biological media that I used to have in my canister, in my sump, with a cheaper media such as lava rock or alpha rock. And over a relatively short period of time I had no expensive media left in my filters, just this cheap budget media types. There was absolutely no change in terms of water quality in either of those tanks. The water quality remained the same, nitrates remained the same, absolutely no change. Then over time I started to replace any sort of biological media with just mechanical filtration. For example, on this tank I have a canister, but it's filled up only with sponges, with coarse sponges and with some filter wool, just for mechanical filtration. And the reason why I need a canister here is because it's a black water tank with lots of botanicals. All of these botanicals are decaying, so I need powerful mechanical filtration to remove all this decaying plant matter from my system. That's the only reason I have here a canister. I know that sponges will also provide surface area for beneficial bacteria, but clearly not as much surface area as biological media. Even such a relatively non-porous biological media as lava rock, it will still provide far more surface area than a sponge. So I keep the canister here exclusively for mechanical filtration. On other similar tanks, Blackwater systems, smaller tanks, I had no filtration at all except a sponge filter for mechanical filtration again. So, and in this tank my nitrates are below 10 ppm, which is actually far too low for all these plants. I need actually more nitrates to feed these plants. So from time to time I actually add some fertilizers just to make sure that all of these plants, including aquatic plants, they get enough nutrition, because despite being relatively heavily stocked, this tank doesn't produce enough ammonia for all the plants to feed on, and it has no biological filtration. Just like my other tank, just like quite a lot of tanks I had before, no biological media at all, and very low levels of nitrates. One other thing that we are being constantly told by the producers, manufacturers of biological media, is that their media helps us to reduce nitrates to a minimum, to almost zero level. But the question is, do we actually want to have zero nitrates in our tanks? Yes, if you have fish like discus, if you're breeding wild angels, or you're breeding some delicate plecos, you want to have zero nitrate in your breeding setups, or in your raising tanks where you raise your fry, or in tanks where you keep this fish, because they're highly sensitive to nitrates. But if you have a planted tank with lots of plants, you actually need nitrates, and the fertilizers that we add to our tanks, quite a lot of them, they contain either macro or micro, they contain certain element of nitrates, because that's what plants need. So the long story short, if you have a planted tank, you would probably want some nitrates in order for your plants to feed, otherwise you'll have to fertilize more. So we don't really need to aim for zero nitrates in a planted tank. It's absolutely fine if you have some nitrates. For example, I would be happy with about 20 ppm of nitrates, even 30 ppm of nitrates in this tank, because I know that plants will enjoy that and they will feed on those nitrates, and I don't have any sensitive fish like discus in here. So by now you're probably asking yourself and me whether it's absolutely useless to invest into high quality biological media. And I would say not always. Let's imagine that you have a bare bottom tank, no substrate, no decorations, no plants, life or otherwise, and you keep some large fish like discus, or large cichlids, or whatever, some other large fish. In that bare bottom tank, in this empty tank, you don't really have much space for beneficial bacteria to exist, except on the glasses of your tank, or except on the equipment that you have inside of your tank, which is clearly absolutely insufficient to break down ammonia into nitrites and nitrites into nitrates, let alone to decrease nitrates to a necessary level. So if you have this kind of tank, a bare bottom tank with no plants, no decorations, you're really lacking surface space for beneficial bacteria to exist, to survive. That's when you actually need to invest into porous biological media in your canister, in your sump, in your something, because you really need to have this surface for beneficial bacteria, and that's when it makes sense to invest in these expensive media. But even in those cases you can get along absolutely fine with cheaper budget biological media types, such as lava rock or alpha grog. Just you will need more of them as compared to, for example, Biohome or Sikkim Matrix. You can use smaller amount of, for example, Sikkim Matrix than you will have to use lava rock or alpha grog. Again, if you're using a canister on this kind of bare bottom tank, you will probably, it will be more efficient for you to invest into more expensive porous biological media, because they will provide larger surface for your bacteria compared to cheaper media. But if you have a sump and you have space to actually put lots of alpha grog or lava rock, it's much cheaper and more efficient to use this media rather than more expensive media. So that's basically the only case when I will use more expensive biological media. On a bare bottom tank with no surface at all for your beneficial bacteria to colonize, and lots of fish, lots of large fish or lots of fast growing fish such as juveniles, that's when you need this surface area for aerobic and anaerobic bacteria, and that's when it makes sense to use more porous media. But that's really the only case when you need this media. For most of us who are not breeding fish, large numbers of fish, who are not keeping bare bottom tanks, who have substrate, all sort of decoration inside of our fish tanks, or live plants, we don't really need pretty much any biological media. We can get along absolutely fine with just a simple sponge filter, or if you have a larger system, a canister filter just filled up with sponges, and you will have most likely zero ammonia, because your plants will readily and hungrily consume all the ammonia. No nitrites and very low levels of nitrates. But again, for many years I have been quite concerned about nitrates, and I have been chasing this perfect number of 0 nitrates or 0.5 nitrates, which is what we're being told very often is an acceptable level. But in most cases 10 ppm, 20 ppm, and even 30 ppm in planted tanks, absolutely fine. You don't really need to go for anything beyond that number, because that's what your plants need to survive and to thrive. And yeah, so I hope this video was useful, and I hope particularly for beginners it was a bit of an eye-opener in terms of the value of expensive biological media and whether you actually need this biological media in your fish tank. So in most cases you will be absolutely fine with either budget biological media such as lava rock. Again, I'm not advertising alpha growth, because this is actually manufactured media, but lava rock is a natural media. It's not manufactured by anyone. You can buy it in a hardware shop for barbecues in a bulk, and it's really cheap, and it's absolutely incomparable in terms of price with any of these more expensive biological media types. In most cases you will be absolutely fine with this biological media, and in even more cases you will be absolutely fine with just a sponge filter, because the rest of the things that you have in your tank, particularly your plants, will provide more than enough of filtration for your fish. So I hope this video was useful. Leave your comments whether you agree or disagree in the comment section, and I will see you soon.